What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the museum of the forgotten fisticuff series. As I deep dive into the names of some of the greatest fighters in boxing history, as I represent those names in a book that I am currently writing. My job in this project is to make sure that I am impartial, unbiased, I am honest, and give these fighters the best opportunities to be represented correctly. And by doing that, I must set standards and criteria. The criteria must be shared across the board. And after 50 years of research into this game called boxing, and what has that research been? I've read millions of articles from the 1700s to recently. I've spoken to over 5,000 fighters. I've met fighters who fought in the 1920s, sat down and spoken with them in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. I've spoken to historians. I've been involved in organizations, tried to pass bills and get pension funds for fighters. I've spoken to thousands of trainers, been amongst them in many gyms from Philadelphia, New York, California, and beyond. I understand this game. So when I select a fighter who, in my opinion, is the greatest welterweight champion in boxing history, I'm putting my name behind that. This fighter's name is Henry Armstrong. Let's talk about Henry Armstrong. I'll explain to you why I feel the way that I do. Now, as a young man, my dad taught me the way to look at a man. You judge him by his actions, because his actions will support his attitude. His attitude will show you his character. And the character is the mark of a man. As a young man, there were three things that I was taught to value. There were no mama jokes during those years. You didn't talk about another person's mother. See, that didn't happen when I was a young man. No mama jokes. You didn't call another boy a sissy. You see, those were fighting words. And I use that word specifically. There were other words, obviously. But there were key words and names that you did not cross. And the last thing you ever did was disrespect your last name. Because your name is your family tree. And the values during the time in which I came, that meant everything. Because when your story is said and done, and it is etched in stone, which means the graveyard marker. What would be in that stone is your last name. And everything in that stone would represent what you have done during the course of your life. So the values of a young man is what transcended him into his last breath. When I was young, if you were sitting on a bench in front of your building, or you were changing a tire, and you saw an elderly person carrying a grocery bag, without thinking, you would stop what you were doing. You would grab that bag and take it all the way to her house. And it could be the 20th floor with the elevator not working. That was your job in honor of a young man. There was no foul language in the presence of an elderly person. There was no sagging of pants, hat turned backwards, in the presence of an elderly person. When you walked into their home, your hat immediately came off, shoes came off, and you asked where they would like those grocery bags to be sat, even though you might have done that 20 times before that. There was yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Yes, Miss Johnson, no, Mr. Johnson. The reason why you have the behavior that you have today is because those values are gone. The father in the household is no more. Sitting at the dinner table, going over your day, is gone. During the time of Henry Armstrong and the men that I will be discussing in the book, had those values whether their dad was in the home or not. But he, as a young man, had his grandmother and his mother and others who would make sure those values stayed intact. So let's talk about Henry Armstrong. He fought from 1931 to 1945. During the course of his career, he went by the name Homicide, Hurricane, and AKA Melly Jackson. He was born December 12, 1912 in St. Louis, Missouri. Died October 23, 1988 in Los Angeles, California. I've had an hour-long discussion with Henry Armstrong. And Henry Armstrong explained to me the details of conversation that would better get me to understand who the man truly was. He stood 5'5.5" weighed 120 to 147 pounds, had a record of 149 wins, 21 losses, 9 draws, and 100 knockouts. He was trained by Al Savani and managed by Whit Ross and Eddie Mead. Remember the name Eddie Mead for one moment. He had 22 total World Welterweight Championship bouts, 19 World Championship title defenses, 3 total undefeated, undisputed World Championship title defenses. And what I mean by that is he had 3 different belts in 3 different weight divisions. And he held them at the same time. Now I'm going to explain something to you that I need you to truly understand when you look at the legacy of Henry Armstrong. I mentioned to you about his featherweight championship title, but then I talked to you about his welterweight championship title. Because after he was featherweight, just in a few months, he became a welterweight champion. He skipped over the lightweight division. And we'll go through what happened during the course of that time. He had 107 featherweight bouts. Won the title October 29th, 1937 as a featherweight. Let's talk about that. Henry Armstrong would become the third black featherweight champion in boxing history. He would become the second black undisputed featherweight champion and the first black American featherweight champion. Let's talk about all this. Henry Armstrong would become the third black fighter to win a title in Madison Square Garden. Theodore Tiger Flowers would defeat Harry Greb in 1926 in New York's Madison Square Garden. Theodore Tiger Flowers would become the first middleweight champion as a black fighter to win worldwide recognition. Kid Chocolate would defeat Lou Feldman. Kid Chocolate would become the second black featherweight champion. The first one was George Dixon. George Dixon was the first black fighter to fight in New York's Madison Square Garden. But the first black fighter to win a title in Madison Square Garden was Theodore Tiger Flowers. The first featherweight champion to win a title in Madison Square Garden was Kid Chocolate. The second featherweight champion to win a title in Madison Square Garden was Henry Armstrong. The third black fighter to win a title in Madison Square Garden was Henry Armstrong. The second black fighter to win a title, Madison Square Garden. Universally recognized was Henry Armstrong. Now, why was that a milestone besides a mouthful? Because Henry Armstrong had to carry the weight of about 4 different men. What am I talking about? He would have 73 welterweight fights and 3 lightweight fights. He would win the lightweight championship title August 17, 1938, when he would defeat Lou Ambers. And he would win the welterweight championship title May 31st, 1938. Why is this important? Because of the time in which the man came. That's one of the criteria. Joseph Louis Barrow was stopped by Max Melling in 1936 in New York's Yankee Stadium. I told you the story, and I will continue to share the story with you about what happened during the time of Joe Louis and Max Melling in 36. What happened? The depression of Harlem and Detroit and Chicago, of young men who were looking up to Joe Louis as a person that they can identify with, the hopes and aspirations that they would one day have. And when Joe Louis was knocked out, by Max Melling, 72 right hands, it shook up the world. And what would add insult to injury was that Max Melling was from Germany. Adolf Hitler was at that time the Fuhrer. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president of these United States. And just a few months later, the Summer Olympics would be held in Berlin, Germany. So Jesse Owens from Ohio State had to clean up the mess that Joe Louis would leave behind by picking up 4 gold medals. And that's why there were 2 Jewish relay racers that were set aside and 2 black racers. One of them was Jesse Owens. Had to replace them. You see, Joe Louis was carrying the mantle, becoming the second black heavyweight champion in boxing history after Jack Johnson did it in 1908. But where Henry Armstrong comes into play, there was no other weight division that Joe Louis can represent. So Henry Armstrong would decide, start to fight for titles and corner the market. And when he defeated Petey Cerrone, stopping him in 6 rounds, Madison Square Garden, what was monumental about that, besides the victory, was that Henry Armstrong would be the first black fighter along with Petey Cerrone, in this case, to fight in a new Madison Square Garden under the new promotion of Michael Jacobs. Jimmy Johnson had the garden sewed up. He did not allow black fighters to fight at Madison Square Garden, let alone for championships. Henry Armstrong broke that cycle. He became universally recognized. Why? Because Petey Cerrone had the New York SAC, New York State Athletic Commission title. And you're wondering, and what does that mean? When Henry Armstrong defeated Petey Cerrone, he held the New York SAC Featherweight Championship title. But he would also hold the vacant NBA, National Boxing Association title. How did he get it? Mike Belois, who was known as the Bronx Spider. He was born February 18th, 1911 in Bronx, New York. He would die June 2nd, 1969 in the Bronx, New York. He stood 5'5", weighed 122 to 132 pounds. He was managed by George Hughes and Eddie Walker. He was the older brother of Steve Belois, 1940s welterweight contender. Now, Mike Belois had faced Alberto Baby Arizmendi, August 30th, 1934. 15 rounds. He would lose the opportunity of the New York SAC at Madison Square Garden. 1936, January 8th, he scored a technical knockout of Claude Varner. I've spoken about him plenty of times. April 3rd, 1936, he would take on Everett Whitemeyer, stopping him in 14 rounds in New York. But he would stop him in Chicago. He would defeat Claude Varner in New York, and he would defeat Everett Whitemeyer in Chicago. He would take on Dave Crawley twice, May 26th and September 3rd of 1936. 10-round draw and 9th-round knockout. August 10th of 1937, Mike Belois was stripped of his featherweight championship title by the New York State Athletic Commission. July 11th of 1938, Belois would take on Providence, Rhode Island featherweight Joey Archibald. He stood 5'2.5", weighed 114 to 130 pounds. He was out of Washington, D.C. Now, let me explain something to you about this. Why it was significant of Henry Armstrong. When Mike Belois was stripped of the featherweight championship title, the New York SAC version of it, that's what gave Henry Armstrong worldwide recognition of becoming the second black featherweight champion in boxing history. To be universally recognized for holding that strap. You see, chocolate wasn't universally recognized. George Dixon was universally recognized because he won the title overseas. He defeated Nuke Wallace for the Bantamweight Championship title. So he was already respected as a champion. When he took on Carl McCarthy for the Featherweight Championship title, he was universally recognized as a champion. So in the featherweight division, he was the man. He didn't have to unify that title. It was already unified. But Henry Armstrong would be the first black fighter as a welterweight to collect both titles at the same time. That has never been done by a black fighter. So Henry Armstrong, first step to being a milestone. When he defeated Petey Cerrone in New York's Madison Square Garden, he had a record of 75 wins, 12 losses, 94 bouts, scored a 6-round knockout. It was for the New York Sack, the vacant NBA, October 29, 1937. Why did Henry Armstrong not defend his featherweight championship title? He picked up the featherweight championship title in October. I want you to understand something. His very next fight was for the welterweight championship title. And he was willing to come in as a featherweight. But he had to weigh 1 pound over the featherweight limit to be eligible to fight for the welterweight championship title. When you talk about weight with fighters, depending upon the fighter, if you come in weighing 150 pounds the next day, you are not, and you are fighting as a welterweight. You're not a welterweight. You should not struggle to make weight. And this is the problem in boxing. Henry Armstrong was 125.5 pounds when he took on Petey Cerrone. He weighed 132 pounds when he took on Barney Ross. Just a few months later. So Henry Armstrong had to give up the featherweight championship belt because he already moved up past the limit of featherweight to take on Barney Ross as welterweight. And a few months after that, in 1938, he would go back down from welterweight and he would take on Lou Ambers. But he was allowed to hold 132 pounds as lightweight coming down from featherweight. Because after the match with Barney Ross, he lost 7 pounds. So he got his weight back up to 132 pounds, and that's when he fought Lou Ambers. And he couldn't make it back down any further to defend his featherweight championship title. And he didn't need to. And that's when Mike Belois would get back into contention and take on Joey Archibald. Archibald would lose his title to a very, very good fighter. And his name was Chalky Wright. Chalky Wright would lose his title to Willie Pep. Pep would lose his title to Sandy Sadler. So Henry Armstrong would then take on Barney Ross, New York's Madison Square Garden Bowl. Long Island City. At the time, he had a record of 90 wins, 12 losses, 109 bouts. And he would go 15 rounds with Barney Ross. He was promised to carry Barney Ross because that was his stablemate. Eddie Mead was the manager of both Henry Armstrong and Barney Ross. He would defeat Lou Ambers. And he would become a 3-weight division champion and hold those titles all at the same time. It wasn't just the fact that he had 3 titles. It's how he won them. To this day, that has never been done. Now, you may say, well, Bob Fitzsimmons was a middleweight champion. He went up to become a heavyweight champion when he defeated Gentleman Jim Corbett in Carson City. Then he went back down to light heavyweight and defeated George Gardner. Yes. But he didn't hold all 3 of those titles at the same time. That's the difference. That's the difference. And if you want to go further, when Bob Fitzsimmons left the heavyweight division, he left the division. He was stopped by Jim Jeffries. Armstrong was not stopped by anyone in the welterweight division besides Fritzy Zivic, but that was later on in 1940. But when Armstrong left the welterweight division, in fact, he was still champion. He never left. But he went down to the lightweight division. He was still champion, and he was not stopped. Depending on the man with the weight, that shows what's inside the man. He was defeated by Fritzy Zivic, 15-round decision in New York's Madison Square Garden. It's October 4th of 1940. Professional debut of the great Walker Smith Sugar Ray Robinson. And the gate did not sell by Henry Armstrong and Fritzy Zivic because Fritzy Zivic at that point was in the 500 mark. No one thought that Fritzy Zivic had a chance with Henry Armstrong. They wanted to see the professional debut of Ray Robinson. And that's why Ray Robinson, recognizing that, became the strongest negotiator. Because he made a deal with Sammy Angott. Angott reneged on the deal and didn't come in on weight, weighing 136 pounds. We'll talk about that. And so Robinson Howe had to wait till 1946 to take on Tommy Bell. And he would win the title that way. We'll go through that. But Henry Armstrong would take on Pedro Martinez. Benny Bass. Benny Bass was from Ukraine. Kid Chocolate would defeat Benny Bass. Bass would face Kid Chocolate, and he would face Henry Armstrong. 2 of the greatest featherweight champions in boxing history. Armstrong would take on Frankie Click, Mike Belois, Fritzy Zivic, Petey Cerrone, Chalky Wright, Lou Ambers, Sefrino Garcia, Bo Jack, Sammy Angott, Sugar Ray Robinson, Tippy Larkin, Juan Zarita, Midget Wargas, Lou Jenkins, Albert Baby Arizmenzi, fought him 6 times, Leo Roddick, and Paul Jr. All the men that I mentioned were champions. But he also fought fighters such as Luther Slugger White, who would be in the ring with Sammy Angott for the vacant NBA lightweight championship title. Armstrong beating the rock with Ralph Zanelli and Earl Turner. Davey Day, Aaron Perry, Aldi Spaldi, Willie Joyce, Earl Turner, and Bobby Manuel. Rodolfo Casanova, Perfecto Lopez, who he fought 7 times. Davey Adbad, Richie Fontaine, Chester Slider, and Al Bummy Davis. Earl Turner, Reuben Shank, Jimmy Garrison. Some of the greatest fighters that were contenders and club fighters during his reign. Between November 3rd, 1934 and January 10th, 1939, he would take on Baby Arizmendi. 3 wins, 3 losses, and 6 bouts. Between February 26, 1936 and October 20th, 1939, he would take on Richie Fontaine. 2 wins, 1 loss, a total of 3 bouts. Between October 4th, 1940 and October 26, 1942, Frizzy Zivik, 1 win, 2 losses, 3 bouts. Between March 2nd, 1943 and August 21st, 1944, he'd be in the ring with Willie Joyce. 2 wins, 2 losses, a total of 4 bouts. I want you to understand the accomplishments of a fighter like Henry Armstrong. Remember, he couldn't use the same restroom of other fighters. He had to shadow box and prepare himself for a bout in mop closets. He didn't have a locker room in most of the arenas that he fought in. We're going to change this topic into another video. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights, all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. We're talking about Henry Armstrong, right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. This is part 1.